it the webcam? Yeah. I was like, where's the camera? Yeah.
Should be live at the normal spot, yeah. Okay, let's go ahead and get ourselves kicked off here. So, welcome all to Ember NYC this fine March. Yes, thank you for joining us after EmberConf. It is nice to see you all here. How many people went to EmberConf? Cool. So then I think the big thing that we're all hopefully going to get out of what we do today, I hope, is conversations about some of the talks that we didn't get to maybe have when we were at EmberConf. I know sometimes when you're watching talks at EmberConf, you're like, oh, this is so great, I have all these ideas, and then who do I talk to about them? And, So hopefully this room is full of enough interesting people that we can have some conversations about some interesting talks. My name is Matthew Beale. I'm online as Mixonic, and I work at Adapar with a couple of the other fine folks who are here. Before we dive into our talks, which I believe are going to be kicked off by Aaron, who's going to give a 5-minute version of a talk, and then we'll do some conversation, and we'll do that another 2 times before we do demos. But before we do that, any announcements?
So for those who weren't able to hear my voice at EmberConf, I am looking for a job. Please come by and chat if you've interested in hiring somebody. Cool.
Thanks, Gaurav. Anyone else? No? Okay, sounds good. I think we're online too. Hello, online people. Howdy. Aaron Sikes.
Howdy. I don't know how far through this we'll get because I haven't had a chance to rehearse. I just kind of familiarized myself with the slides. But Preston, aka Null Vox Populi, gave a really nice talk comparing kind of Ember and React conventions. So we'll go through that. I only knew him online as this purple thing. Didn't know his real name. It doesn't say on his Twitter profile or something, but this is him in real life, Preston. And he has a wife, and he made this app called Ember Clear, and he likes StarCraft, and he seems like a cool dude. And Ember is kind of, or at least was kind of a hobby of his, and he used React at work, and so he had a good kind of base of knowledge to give this talk from. He gave kind of the disclaimer, he only knew what he knew, maybe there were better ways to do some of this React stuff, but yeah, that. And then my disclaimer is even stronger because I have never really worked with React. I consider myself familiar through Twitter and other JavaScript meetups, but I'm definitely coming from the Ember side. So let's see. I saw most people raise their hand for went to EmberConf. How many didn't go to EmberConf? Okay, 5 out of the group. Cool. So yeah, the biggest difference that everything else will flow from is that React is a component library / framework. Oh, let me do this. Hey. React is a component library / framework. Ember is kind of a component router service dependency injection framework. So there's a lot more out of the box. And a lot of these patterns that we'll look at really arise because the main primitive is components in React. I'm kind of going to skip a lot of the code walkthrough that he did. You can go check out the real EmberConf talk if you're interested in that. Let's see. I guess this was a bit of a walkthrough of a demo. So let's. All right. So are we all familiar with To-Do MVC? Who's like seen To-Do MVC before? Who's not familiar? Okay. It's basically it's like the hello world of like UI frameworks. Yeah. Yeah, he kind of showed the React To-Do MVC and the Ember To-Do MVC, and for the main sort of tracking of the to-do list items, he used a service in Ember, and then in React, he used something like this, using the React feature called context. So in React, you can kind of pass properties into components, and that's mostly it, but there's also this magical thing called the context, which you can set somewhere higher up in the component hierarchy, and then you can use it somewhere farther down in the component hierarchy. So some of these first things use that. Let's see. So, okay. How do we lightning this? Well, one way to do it is to use sort of 2 components, right? You use one component high up in the hierarchy to add something to the context, and then farther down the hierarchy, components can grab those things off the context. So you can do that for sort of global app-wide state, and it might look something like this, where at the top level it adds basically an array to the context, and then lower down you can do things that modify that. Whereas in Ember, we would probably just use a service, and you can inject those into the things that need them. Components and routes, etc. Now, when you do this sort of provider component and context using component, you can end up with this really deep hierarchy because you have many different things adding various different things to the context. And this is what it looks like in the React dev tools. Most of these, something like the red ones provide, I don't know. Most of these don't actually have DOM. It's just this gray stuff down at the very bottom that's actual DOM. So you have a deep logical hierarchy, but you might not have a, React doesn't do metamorph tags or something like that. Okay, let's lightning round. So Ember app creation, you use Ember CLI, you do Ember new. That's pretty cool. React, you either use Webpack and figure out how to configure it, or copy a configuration, or you use create React app, which is a little similar to Ember CLI, uses Webpack under the hood. One of the big differences is it doesn't come with testing out of the box, whereas Ember CLI does. Makes that pretty easy. let's see. Here was a big walkthrough of various components. Modifiers are cool. This section was nice. There's sort of some vocab about types of React components. So one thing you'll hear a lot is presentational components, and these are sort of quote-unquote dumb components where they don't really have any logic. They're just UI only. You just pass in properties, and those are rendered into DOM. Something that we use in Ember, but isn't that prevalent in React, is contextual components. So these are sort of one outer component handing a few component instantiators to a child component. And then we can do fancy things like wire data together behind the scenes, or it can just be a nice hint. A nice hint for what components get used together. You'll also hear container or renderless components, and these are sort of the provider type of things we were looking at earlier. Something React has that Ember doesn't have is higher order components. These are sort of components and functions are pretty similar in React, and so things that take a component and sort of turn it into a different component with altered functionality, those are called higher order components. Yeah, state management. Both React and Ember can use sort of component local state. These would be properties you put on your component instance, and then it's very similar in React. But Ember has services which React doesn't, and so there are all sorts of patterns that pop up to help that kind of thing. Concurrency, we have Ember concurrency, pretty great, helps you with lifecycle problems and stuff. React doesn't really have this. It's common to use something called sagas, which is sort of like a lightweight Ember concurrency. It's sort of using JavaScript generator functions to kind of step through an asynchronous thing, but it doesn't quite have the integration into the component lifecycle and that kind of thing that Ember concurrency does. You can see that code walkthrough took a while. We have great add-ons like Ember Simple Auth to make authentication easy, whereas this is like the React example of authentication. He said he had done some research, couldn't really find a commonly used add-on to do that kind of stuff, whereas we have kind of stabilized around that add-on. Testing I mentioned, routing, we know we have a great router. There's a commonly used library, React Router, which does routing, is set up a little differently, much more explicit. You have to import each of your kind of route components and then render them into the router component, which is like also JSX. We have Ember Data, which does some good stuff, whereas you end up with maybe pretty complicated Redux and Saga stuff going on in React. We have kind of the adapter and serializer patterns, which are not common in React land. React Router does do a good job of query params. That's something that's still a little complicated in Ember. There's, a good amount of configuration about whether changing them causes refreshes of the route or setting the default value, and whether changes involve adding a new history entry or updating the current one. And the React one is a little less configuration heavy, but Preston did kind of plug his experimental Ember query param service, which you can try out if you've been having trouble with sort of the native Ember query params feature. Yeah, so it was a long talk. It was dense when he gave it. I didn't think I'd be able to do 5 minutes. I do have a little conclusion of my own based on his talk. There are a few things we could learn from React. Oh yeah, let me show the syntax highlighting slide real quick, because where is that? Oh yeah, yeah. So when you like break the build in create React app, at least you get this nice sort of syntax highlighted thing in your terminal. Ember, it's red. And also the query params, and so he's experimenting with that service. I think in Ember we do a pretty good job of taking patterns that are good from other libraries, but we kind of need to keep that up. You know, if someone is struggling with these kind of complicated React stuff, you can maybe show them Preston's talk as opposed to this retalk. But in particular, I really liked having the concrete side-by-side comparison. I think often the framework wars can turn into sort of fuzzy, unsubstantiated ideological clashes, and just really having the concrete examples next to each other I thought was a really good service to give this talk. So yeah, again, that was Null Vox Populi, Preston. I'm Aaron. I'm courageous on Twitter. Thank you. Yeah, questions, discussion, anything. Who's like built a React app, like been deep in there? Half-ish, cool. Who feels familiar with React through sort of other stuff versus who just doesn't really understand that whole community? Okay.
What's something that maybe someone's, I don't think this talk is necessarily trying to make this distinction, but like, I think there are a couple other things that React does really well that we can take away. What are maybe some other things that people have found like really successful in React code bases that they worked in? Marketing. Yeah, I know I've really, the like TypeScript support and the ability for their text to flow through their template system, such as it is pretty awesome, pretty unique. It's pretty neat to see, like, I want to say that my component expects arguments of a certain type, and you actually can get built-time failures saying that you're not passing the right thing in.
I'm curious what will happen with books and where that will end up and like takeaways that we might adopt from that. I think it's a little too early to like jury still out.
Did you give a slide or books?
No, it was kind of peppered throughout. They influenced a lot of the state stuff, and there was a little similarity with our new modifier stuff also. Not the same thing, but yeah.
Maybe we can look when it takes a look. I think Ember functional modifiers is the closest thing to what we're at.
I really like in React, we really love the template just kind of being there and this
Yeah.
stuff I've heard, you know, and that's, I think that's possible with like inline and large.
It's already possible just with HBS.
Yeah, it's like possible, but I think like out of the box.
Yeah.
I know if you do the HBS backtick syntax highlighting is missing, and people think it's really hard to actually get right. I do think there is a lot of interest in a single file component set up. I don't think there's any RSTs, but like there's pathways to it that people are talking about.
I found the fact that you could express the routing structure within the template also pretty cool. Like it's conceptually it was like a lot easier to read than just looking at JS files with like a bunch of missing functions.
Yeah, and you can use like higher order stuff around your routes, which the standard way to do that in Ember is like with mix-ins or by extending from a base route in all your stuff. But being able to sort of wrap that around all of your routes in a router file is another interesting way to do it.
We didn't quite have like higher order components per se in Ember.
Right. Another thing that's sort of a positive and a negative is the fact that all your components are sort of imported explicitly in other components that use them. So it can lead to this kind of like tangling a million dependencies everywhere, but it's also just sort of making explicit the implicit dependencies we have in Ember templates. But like someone is re-giving the talk about what are all these random words that I don't understand, and most of those are in templates. And there's no explicit, if you're looking at something, there's not a single way to go find out what that means. Whereas React kind of does have that, because you can trace it either to something in your project's file structure or to an npm module name, which you can then look up. So.
Although the documentation is pretty good for it. So if there is a if there's a helper that you don't understand what it is, chances
Sure.
are if it's built into Ember, yeah, you will find it in the guidelines.
You can't just like Google Ember in the word and like find the right thing.
Yes, just gonna say.
Cool, thank you, Aaron. Maybe we can send that first one out. And for our next micro re-talk, Jiaying is going to walk us through new to Ember. What are all these things, such as all these cables?
Need a USB-C one.
I have a USB-C power cable. Oh.
You don't have a HDMI to USB-C converter?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
No, there's not one here. No. No. Yeah, there's not one down here.
Yeah.
You know, I figured Aaron must have had one. I was like, oh, it's definitely there because Aaron must have used it.
I thought he might have had a newer laptop.
Alright, we should be able to do it. There's also a special tray. Do y'all need this still?
No, we got one. Go.
Oh, do we need it?
What's that?
You have to switch the cable over.
Oh, geez, you have to switch the game too. Okay, cool. Gotcha.
Is it? Okay. Excellent.
Good to go?
Yep.
Okay, cool. You to import all of these things, Jiaying.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Jiaying Xu, and I work at Adapar, and we're hiring just like everyone else. Okay. So my favorite talk at EmberConf was about the ABCs of Ember. So how many of you guys have been working in Ember for less than a year? Okay, a small number-ish, a fraction. Well, for those of you that have been working on Ember a while, I guess this will just refresh you about, you know, what it was like when you first started there. So yeah, the purpose of her talk was to go through like the letters of the alphabet, A through Z, and to kind of talk about like the core Ember concepts that stood out to her when she was learning it. And since I have 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to cut out some of the letters and give like a condensed version. A. What is that? That's what I thought when I first saw that. It's like you have this one letter function that's A. Very, very nondescript. But yeah. I also figured out that that's just like an Ember array, you know. It just lets you have observable methods so that you can watch like whenever that changes. And compute it. Yep. Yep, so that's another one of like the core things. Yeah, just lets you declare functions as properties and lets you kind of watch the dependency keys on it and will notify whenever that changes. And so like the property won't be refreshed from the cache anymore, and all that will be recomputed. Ember Data. So that was another new concept to me, coming from like a different framework. I actually came from like an Angular background. There wasn't really this concept of this, you know, whole data store that was managed for you. In Angular, you just had like wrappers around HTTP GET, HTTP POST calls, so there wasn't really this like centralized data store. But I mean, I did learn kind of like the benefits of it, about how it helps you like manage the data that you have. It minimizes the number of HTTP requests that you have to make if you are calling like the same object from 2 different places, and it helps manage all that for you. What's also pretty cool is that they designed it to retrofit to like any backend you want, you know, to REST or to any other standard that you have. Ember the documentary. That was actually one of my favorite things that I watched about Ember. Before that, I didn't really know that much about the history of it, but I pretty much learned that it was just started by 2 guys, Tom Dale, Yehuda Katz, a while back, and it was just, this whole thing that they just got started themselves. They didn't really have the backing of any large company, like unlike how like Angular has the backing of Google or React has the backing of Facebook. It really is just kind of like an open source movement, and they really had to go ahead and find people to help them out. And it's really all about contributing to open source and letting people kind of have the influence and ownership over what they're working on. So yeah, I pretty much thought of the film as like an underdog story, so I thought it was pretty awesome to watch. So if you guys haven't watched it yet, definitely play it. Helpers. So yeah, another new thing I learned in Ember. I wrote some custom helpers myself in the code base I've been working on, but we use it pretty much to format things, format dates, strings, whatnot, like capitalized letters and so on. And we also use this like nifty add-on called Ember Truth Helpers, which let you compose Boolean statements in if and unless statements, so you can like put together ands, ors, nots, equals, not equals, etc. And the JSON API adapter. Yeah. So I actually haven't heard about this before, but it's like not an Ember specific thing. So after, I guess, Ember 2.0, it's like the out of the box adapter that works with Ember Data. But yeah, it's just a formal spec for building the APIs for the backend, and the spec for what your server should return. Ember.k. Yeah, that's another one of those like nondescript things. I'm not really sure who came up with these names, but I mean, after I looked it up, it was pretty clear that it was just like a one-liner, a function that just returns a JavaScript object this. But yeah, it's probably why they deprecated it. Naming conventions in Ember. So yeah, that was kind of like one of the first hurdles I had to jump through when learning Ember and figuring out the lay of the land and figuring out where all my source files are. Because everything is really strict about how things have to go in these specific directories with your controllers, templates, routes. One of the first things I had to do was just rename a route, and boy did I learn that it was strict. But yeah, what's nice about that is if you move from like Ember app to Ember app, you pretty much already know the lay of the land, so it's pretty easy to move there when someone else has like authored another Ember application. RSVP. Yeah, that is not the responde s'il vous plaît thing. It's not like an invitation. I mean, yeah, just like a wrapper around, well, not really a wrapper, a re-implementation of the spec, of the promises spec. Way before that made it to ES6. Ember View. Yeah, so I saw that a lot on like the DOM structure of our Ember code. Since a while back, it's been deprecated in favor of components, but we still use it a little bit in our code base. Yield. This was like one of the fun surprises when I opened like a random template file and I just saw this like one word yield with curly braces around it. I'm just like, what's happening? But yeah, apparently there's like the concept of like inline and block level components, and it's all about, what do you pass in between your start and your end tag of that block level component, and that's pretty much rendered wherever yield is in your custom component. And lastly, Z is for Zoe. I had the pleasure of meeting Tom, Sir, and Zoe at EmberConf 2 weekends ago. And they are definitely like the cutest like web framework mascots that we have. So yeah, that is my condensed version of the talk, and these are kind of all the other letters out there. Cool.
Luke, do you remember why it was Ember K?
I believe it's K Combinator. Yeah. Which means basically no op. Or actually technically return self. Is it? Yeah. Yes. K Combinator, also known as Kestrel.
It's also known as const in Haskell. The K function might be defined as, quote, takes a value and returns a constant query function that always returns that value. Which is interesting since we always invoke it with custom.
Especially for those who have heavily been working with Ember in the last year, like what are some new things that were confusing at first or that you cargo culted for a while without being sure what they were doing? Yeah, I mean, I know a big thing that I did in my in Ember, like in the midterm, in the interim when we went to started using ES module imports, we just started importing Ember in all the files all over the place, and I mean, I felt trolled every time I had to do it. And I didn't really know why. Like indeed, like I don't think technically there is a good reason why, but the why ended up being more like a process why, like you're trying to transition your mindset and then eventually use code transformations to move your code to like a new thing. But yeah, it was definitely for somebody who's been a framework.
When I first started working with Ember, the thing that I could never wrap my head around was how the services work. Like, used to see all this like index as service important. There's definitely not
I could not figure out why item controller was an instance of object controller. Thank God those things are gone.
Yeah, I can see it's like servers, big, like we just hired an engineer, and when there's a problem that comes up, it's like, oh, servers, well, it's a public API. It makes sense, it is, and it solves my problem, so let's use that. So, anyways, I have my own thoughts on servers, but that's one big issue that I was also just always struggling with. It's like, okay, we use a message sort, I guess, but
There was one company where I used the service so much that we could not figure out why each aspect of it being called on the looking pages.
Yeah, especially it was a talk, right? The observer tip jar was this talk, yeah, which was the idea that like observers are bad, but you know you should take that every time you have to use one, you have to put like a nickel jar or something like that, and learn that it has a cost to use this thing. So you could put a literal physical tip jar in your office and maybe that would just be
I already have one.
Init this dot super arguments.
yeah.
Because you need that sometimes, you don't need it always.
Yeah. For me, it was also like the .extend part because Angular doesn't really use inheritance. So, you know, I had to figure out what that meant, and all that kind of made sense after I understood that. It was like the whole concept of like parent and child, but without knowing that, I'm like, what's going on here?
Well, then if you create a mixing, don't use that extends, that will use create. That will make your mind horrible. It will take a very long time to figure out what's going on if you do that.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And our last micro talk will be Hassan here. Now that we have the correct cables, this should be easy business. And Hassan is going to re-give his own talk.
I actually made a talk, guys. It's amazing. Oh, you're going to be such a treat.
It's meme-tastic, too.
Yeah. Woo! Okay. So, I'm going to talk to you guys today about monorepos. Woo! Okay. So, what is a monorepo? So, monorepos are pretty popular these days. Probably you guys have heard about them. Maybe you even worked on a monorepo. So what's a monorepo? It's pretty simple. It is a repository that contains npm modules, and they're organized in some rational manner. Okay, so actually I do want to go back to the slide. So for those of you who weren't there was actually a presentation a little bit before this, which had this big use case that says, users must be able to move their arms. And you know, this was just amazing that I just happened to have this slide that showed what happens when you create a garment where users cannot move their arms. And it's great minds think alike. We're just like riffing off each other. It was amazing. Okay. Anyways, so why do people create monorepos, and why do I, as an Ember developer, actually care about monorepos? Simple answer. Add-ons. Add-ons are why monorepos are interesting and important. So people really love monorepos. Within a repository, code doesn't get out of sync with itself. So when you put a bunch of modules in a repository, those modules will stay in sync. You can have a single PR or even a single commit that is able to actually create changes across all or some or many different modules within the same monorepo. You can have modules that can be tested together in CI, as well as it's a lot easier to file issues and then track issues when you have a bunch of modules that are all co-located in the same repository. You don't have to link across a whole bunch of different repositories as interesting things happen to these issues. So Yehuda had an interesting thread a couple months ago, and it was all about how to create abstractions using modules. And the part that really resonated with me was, and it is also really good because I was actually putting together this talk right at that same time, like, oh my God, he just tweeted just for me. I felt it was just for me. But he tweeted this, he had this really interesting tweet around this idea that the process of creating abstractions is a gradual one. The idea is, and in our case, when we talk about these abstractions as modules, we're really talking about add-ons, in my specific example. So the idea is that lots of times when you first create an add-on, the very first baby step is you do an in-repo add-on. And the idea is that it's a really simple way of creating an add-on that doesn't live outside anywhere else. It's all just like co-located underneath the lib folder in an Ember app. And the next step that he describes is that you actually want to extract that module into a same repo package. So this is where we get that idea of monorepo, and the last one is actually the final end state. But the second case is really interesting, and that's kind of what I'm talking about here. So instead of, or beyond like the step after you have done your in-repo add-on, this is what is a good next step if you want to continue building up your abstraction for your module. So how do we make a monorepo? It turns out that Yarn, that we all know and love, actually has this capability already built into it. It's called Yarn Workspace. And so the idea is that there is, within a Yarn workspace, so the idea is we have a repository. Within this repository, we have all these different NPM modules that are part of our repository that share the same node modules folder. And so the idea is that that shared node modules folder also then has symlinks to the different modules that are part of your monorepo. And that way, everything stays in sync, which is the most important thing here. And so how do you do this? So I actually created a handy-dandy example, which I can show you guys later if you like. And so what it does is it goes from an Ember app with in-repo add-ons converted to an Ember app as a monorepo that has add-ons as modules in that monorepo. And it's really simple. And the reason I put this together is because I literally had just 5 minutes. I can't show everybody everything to do it. And so this way you have a nice reference to go to if you want to see how to do this yourself. Really easy to do. OK. So how do we do this? That's actually me, by the way. Just put that out there. I didn't say that at the conference, but you get the director's cut right now. So this process is actually pretty simple. And actually, I learned at the conference I shouldn't say that. It's not pretty simple. It is very straightforward. I don't know. It's not hard. I'm trying to think of. Just follow these steps, OK? All right, guys.
It's easier than you might expect.
There you go. So the idea is that for each of your in-repo add-ons, you want to run Ember generate add-on for each add-on. And then this is a little trolling part. You can't run Ember generate add-on inside your Ember app. You need to run it outside. That's just how Ember CLI works. So outside of your Ember app, run Ember generate add-on for each of your add-ons. And then once you do that, you take that boilerplate and you move it in the folder that you want it to be the monorepos modules folder. And many people call it packages. You can call it anything you want. call add-ons, it's up to you. And then you want to just simply copy paste your logic into your new boilerplate code in your packages folder. And then finally, you need to specify your package JSON dependencies for those modules that you just created in your packages folder. And so now at the top level, at your Ember app, you have to do a couple special things to tell Yarn that this is now a monorepo. And so the most important thing is you need to say where your modules live. And this is nice. It can be an array of different paths. You can do globs in here, package that star, what have you. And this is what when we say we organize these things in a rational manner, it's really what we mean. Just we put them in some folder where it makes sense, or folders. Also, you need to indicate to NPM that your Ember app is not going to be published to NPM. Now, so what this means, your Ember app itself is private, but the modules contained therein can be public. So that just don't get that confused. There's two different levels here. But you do need to have this in order for it to be an actual monorepo. And then finally, for your dependencies, for your actual add-ons, it's way down here. You can just use a star for the version because, like I said initially, the way Yarn's workspaces works is that it symlinks all of your modules, so they're always going to stay in sync. The version here is not important in Yarn workspace. Got your back. So once you go through all these things, there are, well, at least for me, I have some key realizations. The first of which is that when I did my in-repo add-ons, I had no idea what my dependencies actually were. And so this is, I guess you could say it's a crutch. It's one of those things that, you know, when Yehuda was talking about how you like build up these abstractions, the very first baby step is that you just create a little home for your add-ons. You don't have to worry about dependencies. That's not important. And really what's happening here is that your add-ons is borrowing dependencies of your parent app. And so when you actually decide, okay, I want these things to, like, I have kids that are growing up, and at some point they need to take a little bit more responsibility for their lives. And now they actually have to understand the things that they depend on. And so, and this is where we have to like start going through our add-ons and to understand, okay, well, what are the things that you depend on? And you need to explicitly declare these as part of your add-ons. So that's good. You should understand dependencies for your add-ons. And as part of that, you need to make sure to remove the dependencies from your Ember app because your add-on should be able to bring their own dependencies with them to wherever they go. Also, this is really great. You actually have a place to do your tests for the add-ons themselves. As you all know, there is a dummy app that's created when you do Ember generate add-on, and you can actually have real tests for your add-ons. And then finally, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to publish your add-ons, I recommend using Lerna. Now, if you decide you want a monorepo, that doesn't mean you have to use Lerna. You only need Lerna if you decide you want to publish modules out of your monorepo. That's the point when you, okay, now I should probably look at something else. Or not look at something else, but in addition to in addition to your Yarn workspace. So Lerna is really fantastic for doing that. That's probably a whole other talk in and of itself. And so, anyways, there you go. This is the repository. I can just show you that real quick here, if I can get out of this silly mode. And so I actually have it here. And if you actually Google for Yarn workspace, that is what you will see, and that's pretty fantastic. Creepily accurate. That's what I would say. And also a missed branding opportunity for Yarn. So yeah, and so it's really like I was saying before, it's pretty straightforward. I just have a couple commits in here, and I was really precise in my commits here. I have the initial commit, and then here's some boilerplate. Don't worry about that. But this is the really interesting commit, and that's the commit where you can actually see. Make this a little bigger. Where you can actually see this is precisely what I had to change for it to go from a Yarn. An Ember app with in-repo add-ons to a monorepo. And so it's all right here if you want to go through the whole process yourself. The app runs, you can give it a shot, but it's just like with one simple add-on to go through the whole process. All right, well, any questions that people have about monorepos? Yes?
So, one of the first questions I have is, when you write Ember generate add-ons, doesn't it create backwards directories in ember.git directories and those you have to get rid of?
Yes, you do, and yes, and so that is a good point. There are they're gonna and Ember Generate is gonna do some stuff like assumes that you want this to be its own repository and you get to clean that up.
Learn has a tool. You can do learn and import your package name and it'll bring all the things with it. So you can build your packages or add-ons separately and send them after. That is super nice. That is nice.
Just to confirm, like, I had originally assumed you would have sort of a top-level repository and your app and all your add-ons would be in that packages directory.
You can do it that way.
Okay.
But to be honest, I worked on a mono repo myself that is organized just like that. Where like all the modules and the Ember app itself are all siblings of each other. But you don't have to do it. And so when I was putting this together, I was thinking, well, as an Ember developer, what's the easiest way for me to approach this if I have in-repo add-ons? And so the way I was thinking, the easiest way for me to approach it would be just to treat my mono repo modules the same way as I would treat the in-repo add-ons. So like instead of a lib folder, there's now a packages folder. But you don't have to do it that way. And it's up to you. And that's the nice thing about your workspace. It's really flexible. Like in terms of where you want your modules to live, it's just, you just give it a folder or folders, and it will look there for your modules.
Are there any, does Ember CLI like want to, when you're running the app, does Ember CLI like want to process the packages directory in any way?
It didn't give me any problems. It seemed to be pretty chill about that package folder. I'm sure if I named it a different thing, there are certain names that would make it super confused.
Right.
And so I just, packages seemed fine. Now the one thing I did not talk about at all in this talk was what happens when you are trying to like test in CI and doing things with CI. And you may have to do different things in order to like make things work properly in CI, depending on how you structure your folder. I think this goes back to your question. Like if I were to put my Ember app lower down, then I would probably have to do things with CI. And in the project I work on at CardStack, we do have to do that because deep organized things a little bit different.
So if you want to test an add-on, for example, you just, so if you want to test
Yes,
it, you
that's
do
what
test
exactly.
at the top, and if you want to go and test an add-on, you go into the package.
Yeah, so you probably want to write a script or put something in your package JSON to make that more easy to do. Yeah. All right.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Retalk speakers, for letting us recapture that flavor of EmberConf just one more time. Now we must wait a whole 51 weeks before we can do it again. We're going to break for like 10 minutes here, and then I'll go ahead and do some, I'm going to run some Ember Octane demos. We're going to look at various features in Ember Octane and do a little bit of like live coding, and I would encourage you while we do that to like interrupt me and stuff while I type so we can play and experiment with some stuff. And Luke is also going to give us a demo diving into modifiers, which I think were one of the things that I heard the most people asking questions about while we were at EmberConf. So that's why he's going to go last, so you're all stuck here if you want to learn about modifiers. Okay, cool. 10 minutes, thank you.
Well,
automatically loads the first application. Ember Decorator is not glimmer try. Ember Decorator is using state of glimmer try is designed around state of oh.
Yes! Linux that does multiple monitor configuration in the UI. Look at this. I can't break this thing as hard as I try. This is great. Ubuntu. Nothing too fancy here. Let's not get too nuts.
Matthew, do you know why it went back to stage 1 and 3.8?
So there is an RFC, and it is on the partially. It is on the advice of the committee, being the secret United committee. So basically, things are kind of a mess. There is like a proposal that would dramatically change which areas to do. I actually put very much analyzed some of them, and I think there's a separate proposal that introduces specific options, and then there's stage 1. Basically, the stage 1 stuff is so widely used that nobody thinks it's going to disappear tomorrow anyway, and they probably need to have a migration path, but it's just thinking about UC39 needs to think about what people do something stuff. So basically, it's just saying we'll just HR.
So I have a situation with Twitter. If I install Ember CLI,
Yeah, I think
Ember Decorator,
I think Ember Decorators. Yeah, I think Ember Decorators is just.
follow the warnings, instructions, everything works.
I think Ember Decorators is just wrong. I think Ember Decorators is what's wrong. It needs to be updated. Yeah.
So Ember Decorator will probably move back to stage 1?
I think so.
Is that even possible?
Sure. You just gotta change the way the things are written. Let me. Okay. Note that I'm removing the EmberConf badge. We have left.
Everything's off the record.
Right, yeah. Everything's off the record.
Between us and the live stream.
Yeah, I mean, unless my hard drive is like about to crash from recording the last 10 minutes of us talking, which seems great. Okay, so how many people, everyone's heard about Octane, right? Okay, the marketing is working. Yes, you've all been indoctrinated into the church. Okay. How many people have tried to make an Octane app? Cool. About half. How many people have used decorators? Yeah, a lot of people are familiar with decorator syntax. Cool. How many people have used a angle bracket component invocation? Wow, with Ember components? Yeah, cool. How many people have used a glimmer component? Yeah, much smaller because I think they're still in Canary. So unless you've gone out of your way to try them, you probably haven't run into them yet. So there are a lot of writings out there that I won't try and point you directly at that tell you what Octane is. To give you the quick version over in the corner here, this is a list of 5 things. Chris Perzak, new Ember.js framework core team member, has been doing a lot of work on Octane and various parts of this system. He wrote a neat 5-part series that I think is all published on the Ember blog, and some of it might be on his blog, going through all 5 of these things as like the major underpinnings of Octane. The aim is that if we landed any one of these things on their own into Ember, it would be very confusing if we were like, it wouldn't have a lot of coherence, and we'd basically make people go through a mental shift for each of these things. Swapping all of your Ember code between named classes is going to be a big deal. It might have a code mod, it also has a mental shift around like how the constructor works and other things. Introducing modifiers is going to be a thing that is maybe the most incremental of any of these, but it's still going to be basically you move away from using lifecycle hooks on your components, and you move toward using a new tool that's made just expressly for this purpose. The aim of Octane is to take all these things and batch them up into one cognitive edition. So if you were to think like I am learning basically a new-ish framework, of course the underpinnings of that are that practically we're providing like a really good migration path for all this stuff, and everything's backwards compatible. So even if you're using an Octane app and you have like some bits of the code that are still using classic Ember, it's okay. It'll still run, they'll still interact the way they're supposed to interact. But the mental shift is to try and get into the mindset of working in this new framework with these new tools. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like. Any questions before we write some code here? Okay, so I have some cheating. I did indeed practice a little bit for this, as is usually wise when you're going to do some live coding. So we're going to make a new app. I'm going to call this Zappy Game, and to make a new Octane app right now, we're in like the preview edition of Octane. There are pretty sweet docs. So there's this web page, which is like the most important single URL because it will take you to all the other things. Whoops, that's not going to work. I'm sorry. Oh, yeah. Yes, Linux on the desktop. Isn't everyone? Oh, so people are so impressed, right? Oh, okay. Yes, so this is the web page that takes you to all the different things. Importantly, there's a whole new Quickstart guide, which if you want to like do a really quickie, just like hold my hand, walk me through building an Octane app. This is a great way to do that, and it touches on a couple of the different APIs that are new. Honestly, I think you'll be surprised at how much of it is familiar. I'm halfway down the page here. I'm a little bit over halfway down the page, and the first Octane-ish like new programming model thing I see is really here. So a lot of the framework is new, a lot of the framework is still pretty much the same, so don't feel too threatened by it. And if we go back here, the other thing is there's an upgrade guide, of course, and oh, I guess it's just part of the Quickstart app is also that all of this other documentation, the guide documentation in general, is also, a lot of it has already been audited and edited, and it's still underway, but that's a great spot to dive in if you want to see, like, you know, how are actions different in Octane versus in, you know, classic Ember. So there are good resources out there to look at this stuff. So let's go ahead and make our new Zappy game. We're going to use a blueprint to opt into this. By default, if you make a new Zappy game with the latest version of Ember, you just get classic, good old-fashioned Ember. And it is a Octane app blueprint. I'm also going to use Yarn instead of using NPM. See, great thing that I hooked up my internet. So nice. Kind of in Ember, an Octane app that is another good app to look at besides the Quickstart, if you want to take a look at an Ember app, would be to take a look at the EmberConf schedule. This is an app that a couple of my colleagues at Adapar worked on, Kevin Pfefferly in particular. It is both mobile responsive and it works offline. It's a progressive web app. It gets like 100, I think, on Lighthouse. I think it gets a 99 on performance score from Lighthouse for an Ember app, which is pretty darn cool. Yeah, you can go to GitHub and you can actually check out all the code for that as well and see what a Octane app looks like when it's progressive web app compatible and such. So I encourage you to check that out if you want to use PWAs at work. How many people work on a PWA? Yeah, not many, right? But everyone knows what it means. Man, that Google marketing is really good too. Really good at it.
What are the differences between the regular blueprints and the Octane?
So glad you asked. Yes, Alex asked, what's the difference in the blueprints when you generate this app? So the most important single difference of this whole thing is probably just that your like Ember CLI version in your Ember source version are pinned to Canary. That's like the most significant thing, so you can opt into all these new features. Another thing that's a significant thing that comes here is a couple optional features that are turned on. I'm surprised. Well, I guess jQuery integration like defaults to false, so it's turning off jQuery, so jQuery is not available in Octane out of the box. You have to turn it on or just import it and use it normally. And also in environments here, there are a couple other feature flags in Ember. So these are these are feature flags in Ember. You can only use Ember feature flags from Canary. You can't use them in beta because beta is what will become the next stable. So we don't want you turning things on and off while it's in beta. We just want you testing it out. So yeah, none of this stuff is actually in a beta yet. So I think those are the major differences. Besides that, it behaves largely like Ember apps that you might have used before.
I bumped into, I was using a .ember CLI file to specify the port. And the new blueprint uses a .ember CLI.js.
Yeah, we can open that up and take a look at it. Oh, what did I do here? Does anyone remember what that syntax is for turning off the watcher? I swear this wasn't a problem before. Does anyone?
Dash no dash watcher?
Dash no dash watcher? Where is it in here? Alec should know this. Turning off the watcher. Well, this is disappointing. So I seem to be having a problem with Watchman, and there is a way to like tell it not to use Watchman at all. Yeah, it should. Oh, there's dash dash watch, dash dash no watch. I think there is something else. I think there is something else going on.
Actually, that is like a different error than the first one you got.
Yeah, I'm gonna quick look at this file, and if not, then I'm just gonna move over to a different code base. Actually, let me just do that. Okay, I can just look at the. Yeah, preview mode here. This must have like literally just changed though, because I swear I did try all this like no more than 2 hours ago. So something definitely just changed. Nope, nothing there. Okay, cool. Well, this is why it was a good idea that I did a stab at this before. So let's take a look at that version of the game. Okay. So this other one was just called Ember Quickstart because that's the kind of default name that they give you. So let's go look at that instead. See, Linux on the desktop, it totally works. Okay, so I've got some linting errors over here, but nothing that is fatal. So this app, if we take a look at it, is a pretty simple app. It's a 500 pixel square here, and I've got this little thing on the side. What I want to do is make like the beginnings and just like, I never thought that we'd go all the way through it, but make a little game where you can move this little cursor around, and maybe it can like shoot lasers out or something like that, like a little sliding game. So we put together the basics of it. Cool thing is, you know, some of those things that we heard in Jiaying's talk about what are these things I'm looking at, like Ember View. There's no Ember Views. I've got this Ember app that's doing a bunch of stuff, and it actually only has 2 divs in the DOM at all, which is pretty cool. I see celebrations. That seems good. Let's look at what this looks like from the outside. So here is the application template. It just invokes a component called Zappy Game. And Zappy Game is just like, kind of uses the same file system layout that we've had before. For a while, Ember Octane was maybe going to take like, also add a new file system. We just decided that that was too much. There are some blog posts about it and such, but it was going to keep everything else from shipping, and it didn't seem like it should. So the kind of like, there's the next edition of Ember is already being talked about as being like focused on builds, which kind of lines up with doing some file system changes. So here is let's look at the Zappy Game template. When I look at components, I usually really like to look at templates first. They help me think about what's going on. So I've got a couple of pieces, a couple things I'm reading off the state and in action in here. So importantly, I have this ship Y, which if you look at this again, you can see I've got the number 53 up there, which is just showing my percentage from the top that my little icon cursor is supposed to be. Oh, I'm in mobile mode here. So changing up at the very top left corner there. So that's this .ship Y, and I'm also passing the ship itself into another thing that's responsible for rendering the ship. Here's my div for Zappy Game, and here I'm using a modifier, and we'll come back to those in a moment. Let's take a look at what the JavaScript is going to look like. So this is a Glimmer component, so I'm importing from Glimmer component here instead of importing from Ember component. Export default class, we do the same thing and extend from a Glimmer component. A couple different pieces of syntax here that you might not have seen before. So the first interesting piece of syntax here is a public field, it's called. A public field is basically a little piece of code that's going to run at a special moment in the JavaScript object lifecycle just after the constructor for the object is called, but before it is returned back to whoever said, give me a new instance of that object. So it's like a slice in time that really we had no ability to access in JavaScript before, which now we have the ability to put things into. And you can see this line actually has a semicolon at the end, so it's actually evaluating the right-hand side of this statement when the instance boots. So when we say, give me a new Zappy game component, it's going to instantiate new ship here, and it's going to set it as a value onto ship. Some of you have maybe, who's ever like worked with an array before where they've done this, and someone in code review has called this out, or linter has called it out. Yeah, so when we do something like this, we're putting a mutable object on the class. And the way that classes are implemented in JavaScript is with prototypes, which means we're actually sharing that instance across, or that instance of the array across all the instances of that object, which means if we mutate it once, it gets mutated for all those different things because they're actually sharing the same instance. This can be really confusing. So sometimes you'll see someone will use init and they'll set the array inside of init. Sometimes you'll see someone doing like a computed with like a little bit of slang to say, oh, just give me an array that's unique for this one object. Give me a new array every time someone calls this computed. We don't need to do that anymore. Public class fields, you could just say array equals array, and you would get a new instance of that array every single time you made an instance of the object. So pretty neat.
So the initialization for the variable runs after the constructor.
Right. So if I had if I have a constructor in here,
If I'm not mistaken, that runs like in the super, but I might be
no. So it's actually going to run. That's a good but subtle question. I believe it's going to run after init. So there is also like public class fields. There is a slight uncanny. There's a
constructor initialization of that init. Is that right?
Yes. Yes. A constructor constructor init, and then your thing. But even the init is running in the super of your constructor. So hold on a sec though. This doesn't matter. The reason this doesn't matter is, so there are some like arcane things going on here. A thing that's going on is this is a glimmer component. So there is no init. It's not an Ember object. Init doesn't exist on this thing. There is only a constructor. Now it's true that you can't get away with any any JavaScript object that you're going to instantiate. Like it will have a constructor. So you could have an Ember object. You could have a like, let's say that I instead have a class. Let's say this is a Zappy game Ember component, and I want to extend from Ember components. You can imagine that you can do this, and you can do this. In this case, there is an init, and you should always use the init. The init is the right thing to use because this is an Ember object, which means it uses the init lifecycle. If you use constructor, it's certainly present. It's going to be called, but like the timings were never really designed because the ability to specify that didn't exist before.
I guess my
there's also no ability. Well, there is an ability here to do public class fields. I'm sorry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
How do public classes, sorry, public fields will work with init?
But they should be after. Pretty sure they're after init.
Okay. So that's a gotcha problem.
So I'm pretty sure they run like, so for a glimmer component or whatever, I'm pretty sure those initializers run like immediately after super, and you can't actually use this before super.
Right.
So the reason that's important is because you're allowed to use those properties. You're allowed to use this .array and this .ship in your constructor, and they'll be valid. Because you can't use this before super, and after super they've been initialized to those ones. So.
Yeah, but there are
Excellent.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there
Yes.
are truly things when you use Ember component with plus syntax, and you end up with a constructor in it and a bunch of
Yeah, and so these are totally valid edge cases. We are working hard to make sure that we have lints around this stuff. I don't know if I won't try and demonstrate the lint. I'm not sure if it's here. But for instance, there is there's a lot of discussion about adding a decorator here that would apply to the class itself. That when you're using Ember object, you must use at classic. And one of the reasons is because if you're using this classic, that means we can also do analysis on the program to know if you're using constructor in here, and we can yell at you. Like we can make sure that you're not using the constructor where you should be using init on an Ember object thing. At the end of the day, this is like a slightly tricky issue because ignore anything else that could be happening in the file. How do you know this thing is really an Ember component or not an ES class? Like there's no way to really know. So even the lint is like a little bit tricky, but it is important because we don't want people. What we want to teach people is you're using old classic Ember, use init. Good, done. You're using new ES classes, use constructor and use it with confidence. Don't try and just like find the timings in between and worry about them.
Sorry, didn't mean to troll you.
No, that was a really excellent
I think
thing.
this really covers all those edge cases in his native classes and decorators.
Okay, so that was our first piece of new syntax. That was pretty good. The second thing that we've gotten here is an action, and I guess let's go ahead and look at that first. So actions on classic Ember components, we use an object that's on the Ember component class definition, and then on that object we have a whole bunch of things that would look maybe like actions. And if we wanted to have this listen for keys, then you would have a key here, listen for keys, and you would have something like this. This is like less than ideal for a number of reasons. One of the reasons that's kind of confusing is listen for keys. This function, the this of this function here is actually the class itself. It's not the literal actions object, even though that's what it looks like it should be. So a couple like subtle things, and as someone who uses the framework every day, you certainly like learn that stuff by rote and you just type it and you don't really think about it. But for new people coming to the framework, those are like the kind of subtle cases that really troll them as they're trying to learn something new. So instead, on Glimmer components, we use an action decorator. And the action decorator identifies and flags our actions. It's kind of doing two things. One thing it's probably going to do is to make sure that you lint to make sure that you're actually calling action when you refer in here, so that your actions are clearly delineated from other things. We can also, with action, make sure that you're not that you are not declaring an action that matches some other lifecycle hook. So, for example, destroy, which is still called on Glimmer components. There's a couple hooks that are not called, but destroy is still called. So we don't want you to define an action with that name. So action will do those things, and then action is also going to be the thing which is basically responsible for turning this method into a callback. I think this is by far the best framing that I've heard of what the action helper does. So in other languages, you can take like, you can set a variable to equal some method on an object. And when you call that variable later on as a function, like it still has the correct context. JavaScript is a little bit weird in that it really doesn't have a built-in mechanism for us to say, I have an object dot some method, and please keep the same definition of your like actual context of the method on that you used to have. So you need to manually do this conversion of something that's a method on the object into a callback that has the proper context over it that you can call it from anywhere in the system. This is not something that a lot of other languages have to worry about, but in JavaScript we do have to have a spot where you actually do it. In React apps, you'll see in the JSX templates, you'll see like using arrow functions or something to like create the correct binding. In Ember, the mechanism that we're using for the transformation will continue to be this like idea of an action, the cognitive idea that like I have a conversion to a thing. In aggressive, I don't think this would happen, but like you can imagine a more aggressive version of this API would just be to call this callback. Like I'm creating a thing that's going to be called by someone else, and please just like wrap over it and do the things that could be called as callback later on. I think for Ember developers in general, this should look like a pretty familiar system. We're not referencing the listen for keys as a string, which is something that we do in classic Ember, and that system is just going away. We just reference property. It's better in many, many ways. Seems good.
Is that going to be usable? Is it already usable in? No, it's not. Sorry. It be usable with Ember components too?
With an Ember component, because this is actually referencing the method listen for keys, actions on Ember components are defined on the hash and not on the instance itself.
You won't be able to use the add action in a
Oh, the decorator. The decorator you can use in an ES Ember object, yes, and it will do the things that you would expect it to do on an Ember object. It will put it like onto the actions hash. Yeah, so again, this is another like old world, new world thing. There are many ways that these things can kind of be combined, but if you are using an Ember classic object, you want to continue to use the action referencing it by a string. Like, we should still be giving you like error feedback if you try to do something else, and we want you to keep using that old system. And when you move to the new system, just do it all at once. Move to Glimmer components and move to this new way of referencing your actions as one full step.
It does work if you use the add action helper to call it this way.
Okay. Yeah, I would still encourage a string version, and I would think that we should maybe lint or assert. but maybe that's an academic point for me to make. It might not be a practical one.
At this point, it's been enough versions that it probably wants to do that.
Yeah.
This is kind of the closure action style also that a lot of people have been using.
Yeah, in that we're using action as a helper here. Yeah. And there are there are some designs floating around that I'm not sure if they're going to make it into Octane or not that would say like, can we get rid of this entirely? Do we not need this? But right now, at least, this is still the prescribed and the documented way that we're doing things. We'll see if it changes anytime soon. Probably will. Cool. So next thing that's going on here. So the contents of this are pretty rote. We're just going ahead and using an event listener on key up when this listen for keys thing gets called. This is an element modifier, and Luke is going to give us a more like in-depth look at these. But there is a package called Ember Render Modifiers, and it basically gives you a couple tools that you can use to attach to the lifecycle events of DOM nodes. Glimmer components have no did insert element, no will destroy element. There's no way to interact with the DOM. They don't have an element property. Like, you don't have a choice but to use this new thing called modifiers. And so they are definitely important to learn about and internalize a bit. But basically, when you want to interact with the DOM, you end up using a modifier, and then the modifier could do something on its own, or it can call other actions that you pass into it. In this case, we're passing an action into it, and then it's doing something here. To look at the next piece of
Before you move on, is that cleaned up after this example, or is there a added event listener?
If this was added to the DOM multiple times, it would continue to add event listeners. Yeah, because it's on the body. There is a thing like, we used to need to remove event listeners from elements, but that was only in really old versions of IE that they would leak. In modern browsers, actually, you don't need to tear them down. If the element is disposed of, then the listener just goes away. However, in this case, you're totally correct that a listener on body itself would need to be torn down because the body is not going to go away. And there is a complementary to did insert. Ember Render Modifiers comes with a will remove, will destroy. So you could give yourself another action for like tear down listener or something like that. That would work fine. Yeah. Destory, yes, my class. That typo is my Achilles heel. Okay, so let's go to the template and look at the next thing in here. So we have another invocation of another component called ship. Note that this didn't need to be like dasherized or anything. We're just invoking a thing called ship, one word, capitalized, and the component itself is indeed just one word, and that's all totally fair game. The fact that it's capitalized is the thing which separates it from this. You can imagine that basically like this element is a reserved thing that the HTML authors say that they might one day name something a single word lowercase element. So you cannot invoke your own components with lowercase. In the past, Ember basically took the same line as the web component spec, which said that anything with dashes is fair game for you to make a web component. So we figured Ember component, web components are still an interesting and powerful tool, but they're definitely not all the things that we need from a component system in a framework. And in this case, moving to the simple popular React system of doing a capitalization is another elegant way for us to identify our things as different from the built-in HTML stuff. So we're invoking ship, and we're invoking it here with @ship, which identifies that we're passing it an argument to go to the JavaScript code with the @ sign, and then we're using curlies, and we're passing this .ship, which is going to read the property ship off of here. We'll maybe look at that in a minute, but let's take a look at the inside of ship.js. So inside of ship.js, we just have a get that says I want to make some styles, and it reads our argument of ship off of the arguments here. So we have this args, and we're just using a getter there. There's no tracked thing going on, which you may have seen before. Yeah, so here's our this.ship style, which is reading off of our ship.js. And we have a class here, and actually I guess I'll do something neat in a minute that we haven't done yet. So that's passing the argument to ship, and that's what lets us move this thing up and down. Kind of a neat facet of using Glimmer components. Ember components can do this too, but we can pass in other arguments here. that don't have the @ sign, and those things are actually passed as plain attributes. So here I'll go ahead and put like a new ship class, and by default, I kind of expect, well, I guess it doesn't blow up. So it doesn't blow up, but this argument, this attribute of class new ship actually isn't being put anywhere. If we look at the DOM, we shouldn't see this thing. We still just have our class of ship sitting here. And the reason for that is that we haven't told it where to go. So components don't have an element. They don't have any of the DOM lifecycle hooks. So if we're going to pass in our attributes, we need to say what element we actually want it to attach to. So if we go back into our ship template here, I should be able to do, this is from memory. No curly braces? Yeah, say from memory, sorry. Right. So now here's my class new ship that's been added to the thing. So you can basically say this is where I want any passed in attributes to go. And that allows you to have templates that are protective by default, where you say, I don't want the outside world to be able to put classes on my stuff. Like, I'm very carefully calculating to see these classes and all these attributes. Please don't mess with them. Or to say, okay, outside world, please go ahead and like you can set classes and stuff on there. There's also nothing that says that you can't do this multiple times. So as a really simple example, you can just drop this in here multiple times, and we have new ship. Our attributes get reflected multiple times onto things. And I guess the last piece of neat thing that is that ... attributes is also where your element modifiers will go. So if you passed an element modifier onto the ship, here if we said like I want to, actually can I just do this? Action this dot log insert, something like that. So this is on our ship itself. We go ahead and go back to our Zappy game JavaScript and make a new action.
This doesn't actually work yet.
Oh, it doesn't.
Is this intended to work?
Yep.
Eventually, but not yet.
I should trust Luke because I imagine he also double checked his world. Yeah, so element modifiers are not allowed in components, but good times, good news, this is a lie. They are allowed, it's just that the lazy Ember.js developers have not done the work to make it happen. But yeah, this is a totally valid way to use the system. And the idea is totally that like your internal element might have some behavior. You want to attach event listeners to that element or something. Just passing attributes would be arbitrarily limiting what you can do with that system.
Is there a way to merge the classes?
They are merged. They are merged.
It shows only new ship without the ship class.
I think that would also be a bug. Good catch though.
Should attributes be last? Does that make a difference?
We can try. I don't think that's supposed. I don't think that would change whether or not it's merged. Here, I'll just do it on this one so that we can see if it's only on the second one. Oh, look at that.
How about that?
Look at that. Not sure if that's a bug or not. Yeah, because it seems like if they merge in one way, then they should merge in both ways. It seems arbitrary that they would stomp in one way but merge in the other.
I would also think that ship would win if ship was after where you split the attributes.
Right. Well, that's basically what's happening here, right? Ship was winning in this case, but in this case, the version from attributes doesn't win.
Isn't the top one is a new ship?
No, the second one was new. The second one is the new ship on the right. Oh no, you're right. The attributes always won, and the ship was just ignored, which is totally wrong. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Say I should have just named this like Ember Octane Bug Hunt, and it would have been a more accurate title to the. Yeah. I hope.
We're all contributors now.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just point out one more thing on here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Luke, who will give us a little bit more detail about modifiers. The thing I want to point out is that I haven't really talked about Tract at all, which is kind of cool. What Tract is doing is actually pretty small in here. We looked at the ship JavaScript, and when we had ship style, we're just using get and whatever here. This is a JavaScript. This is the syntax for a JavaScript getter that you're installing on the class. This is plain Pojo, plain old JavaScript, not any kind of fancy Ember stuff, and that's really cool. So that means that this as a getter is going to be called every single time we render. It's going to call this function. There's no caching, no memoization or anything. It's always going to compute this combination of a string, which is important to know because maybe if you're doing something, this could be really expensive, and you would want to understand that the default pattern now is a little bit more JavaScript work. but in exchange for a lot less bookkeeping on Ember's behalf. And we found that the performance trade-offs on that seem like they are good, and tools like React also show that the performance trade-offs on that kind of stuff is fine.
And we know that Ember memorize only which is pure JavaScript.
Right, so there could also be, I don't know if there is,
Memorize decorators.
right, so you would use a decorator called like @memorize or whatever, and you could throw that before the getter, and that would be a fine way for you to say like, here, please memorize yourself, and it's kind of more declarative and not implicit like uncomputed. So to look at what that looks like, note that like we're keeping track of where the variable for y, how it changed, and we're actually doing that through a couple different layers of indirection. The actual spot where I'm setting y is by setting this.y ++ or -- on a class called ship. Ship, remember, is instantiated and stored as a property on the Zappy game, which is passed as an argument down to the actual ship component, which is then using it in a getter and then rendering it on the screen. And through that whole system, just because we declare this thing as tracked y, it's going to be bound in the template. Like the templating engine knows basically when it initially calls this thing to calculate this whole stack of stuff, it knows that y was a tracked thing, and it can keep track of changes to it, which is pretty neat. Because this is not even, this is a plain JavaScript class. There's no Ember base class, there's no glimmer base class, or anything like that. Pretty cool. ++ and -- here are a little bit tricky, but it turns out that ++ and -- are really just the same thing as calling like this thing equals this thing +1 or -1. It actually does set the property, and setting the property is the thing that tells track that something has changed in its world. You can't mutate the contents, so I'll type out an example in a minute, but as long as you are setting the property of y, which -- effectively does, then you're going to trigger the button.
If ship was actually from like an add-on or some other thing you did not own, and you still wanted to be able to track it, would you have to do it at ship style now?
Oh, that you didn't touch at all?
Yes.
No, similar to Ember, you have to know when, no, I mean like if it does not have track properties and it's just updating y, Ember will have no idea. Similar to how in computed properties today,
So
if
how,
it was
how
just
do you
setting
make
y,
it tracked if it is a thing you want to import from like an add-on?
You could try.
The general answer to that is that you want things to be immutable in your system. You want to be given a new copy of the thing every time. So if, say, something had a descriptor, there's a third-party library that knows how to move the ship around, what you want it to give you back is an object that defines the new ship position, and you don't want it to mutate the thing. You want to give you a new object for the ship position every time, and that way you can just set it. The other thing you could do is say it didn't give you that object, but it did give you some kind of hook or callback. As long as you are calling the setter for y, as long as you're saying like this.myState equals this.myState, even the same exact object, that still calls the setter, which would trigger the trackness of the thing.
Yeah. If you had like on ship update in there, you could do this.ship equals this.ship.
Yeah, so the general pattern would be like, say, I'm trying to think of how this could actually be typed out. Let's make a new thing called like a tracked like ship state, which is going to equal, going to have like x and going to have y, something like this, right? And we could even, I guess we could say that ship state isn't going to be tracked. We want to say that ship state isn't tracked? I see heads nodding that we want to say ship state isn't tracked. Okay. So let's say ship here, ship here is going to be totally disconnected from the world. Now, if it's truly like this, we have no way of knowing, that this dot, well, actually, we do know that this y or this thing didn't change. We know because ship move up actually fired, right? So let's go ahead and move our ship instance to something else. I'm going to give it a really poor name just so we can make this clear. I think that's pretty good. So what we expect now is when this thing initially boots, our ship state, well, we still need to have a thing that actually gives it back. So let's get our ship. And our ship is going to return a thing that has, well, basically the state, right? We can we just have it return the state, this.ship instance.ship state? Seems good.
To update or move up and move down the functions also.
Weren't they already? Ship instance?
No, on the ship class. It's
still this dot y. It should be this dot ship state dot y.
Oops. Cool. Almost there. We don't have an initial, our ship, is our ship state, the thing which is not being yielded down here. Oh, well, this one is 50, and this one is 0.
Initialized it to 50. Good.
The initialization is 50 and 50. Yeah, let's take a quick look at Zappy game here. So we called this dot ship y, which seems fine. This dot ship. Is there a reason why this would be different in this? The thing is, the internals of this dot ship.
What's a getter that returns the ship instance?
Yeah, I think that should be fine. I think this is just because we don't know about the.
It should be.
I'm not sure why it's.
This ship returns a ship instance.
What is the ship? Do we modify the ship class already?
Yeah, so I mean, I can put a debugger in here and look at for sure. But basically, the fact that we have
Wouldn't we want to at least like track the ship?
so here's our ship, and it is indeed this ship instance dot the ship state. So we should be reading the empty, like the object, off of our ship down here, right?
Oh, so what if we track the ship instance?
Well, I'm not. I'm trying not to track it because basically I was trying to like show that it isn't working before we do anything. But I'm a little bit confused by why we're not getting like this stuff makes sense. That I'm getting errors here, like this makes sense. But I'm a little bit curious why we have a value of 0 for our offset inside of the thing. But maybe we fix that by doing the tracked. I'm not quite sure. So that's a little bit of mystery, but we can see here we're getting a failure that we're not calling set to update the Y property. So this is the default error in Ember is actually still the same. Like you're changing like some property that is observed in the template, and you're not actually using set to update it. So let's go ahead and change this. We can't do this.
How does it know that?
So this isn't going to work. We can't track this thing because like Ember won't know when ship state would even change here. So this is something that we can't do. So what we need to do instead is we need to tell something that we're tracking that a value has been updated. So let's go ahead and say, I'm wondering if I even have a spot in.
Track ship instance?
Yeah, I could track. I could track ship instance. Yeah, you're right. I guess ship instance is the right thing to track here, even because then we can just reset it every time. That's fine because it doesn't really matter what level the coarseness is at. Okay, so we're still doing the thing, but I believe in here where we're calling move up and move down, we can then say ship instance equals this dot ship instance. And now we should trigger the setter when we do the thing. That's not going to work.
Should we pass in ship instance to the ship component?
No, in theory, I would expect that this would do the thing for us, right? Because we have a thing that's actually returning our ship state to this dot ship inside of the template already.
Yeah, that's a thing with an excellent line.
Yeah. So okay, live coding demo. I'm gonna cut us off. I don't want to keep this going down. But yeah, the idea is that if you have if something is a mutable object and it's being mutated and you have no observation into the system, the simple answer is just like track a property and set that property again to be that same object, even if it's been mutated. Every time you call this dot whatever, this dot something equals, you're always calling the setter, and that's what tracked is looking for. Tracked is installing a setter on this line here. It's installing a setter so that anytime we call this dot ship instance equals, we're going to tell the system, you should like check it out. We've probably got a new value here. So it doesn't matter what you set to that thing. Okay. One more question.
Yeah.
Do you want to guess out?
Can you say anything about like what references this adds internally? Like, I'm wondering if this adds new concerns about linking memory and objects or something. So will @track cause those objects to turn to garbage?
Yeah. So unlike the computed system, which did retain like references of things and had to have teardown that happened, the way that tracked works is referenceless. It keeps track of like long strings are basically e tags. Actually, I think it uses numbers, which is a cheat, but like basically they're effectively e tags
problem is right now with the rates, we don't have the same.
Right, I'm not sure we will. You may need to, well, either like, the first thing is that the track system is compatible with the computed system, so that if you're tracking something that part of the computed chain, it actually does like pay attention to that. But the second thing would be that you just go to use the mutable pattern, don't mutate the array, or if you do mutate the array, make sure you set something in the track system so that it can know to actually reflect the thing you like things it's new. Cool, thank you very much for
Cool. So I spent a few more days in Portland after EmberConf, meeting with my team, and we usually every year, in addition to like doing company stuff, we like to kind of pick at least one thing from EmberConf to spike on together. And this year we were like, oh, I've got to play with element modifiers. And in particular, I'll just start with like what my idea in my head was. I wanted to make something where I could do this. So I had a button element with an action on it, and I wanted to be able to do keyboard shortcut and have it work. And it seemed like this is probably got to be one of like a relatively easy thing to do with an element modifier, maybe. So my first step was, well, where are the element modifiers defined, and how do I, maybe I can look at them to see how do I make my own. So I started off by tracking them down to this Ember render modifiers add-on, but as Pizorak says in his blog post, these are implementations of these kind of standard 3 modifiers: did insert, did update, will destroy, that Ember provides. And there's nothing in the docs here about creating your own. I was like, huh, okay. So then I looked, and finally I found the hidden URL that Matt showed us before, which is the Octane, or Ember.js.com/edition/Octane. I found the guides for the talk about the modifier part, and my heart fell when I found this line: APIs for writing your own modifiers are currently being stabilized. I was like, oh man. But there are, fortunately, some experimental add-ons to work with the experimental edition. One of them was written by Spencer. Hi, Spencer. This is Ember Functional Modifiers. And so I started, this was the first one that I found, in fact, the only one I could Google. And I don't have any, we were talking about like who has React experience. I've never written any React code. And trying to make sense of this was like, I was like, what? My brain was melting. Because it all relies, I now kind of understand it, like relies on closures for state, and you have to return a function that does your cleanup. And I was just like, I don't know. Fortunately, it was right at that moment that I was having dinner with Matt, and Matt said, "Psst, Ember Oil Modifiers." And I said, what? So I searched for it on GitHub, and I think the first thing that comes up is Robert Jackson's fork of this project. I don't know why, but eventually found this one. So this is Ember Oil Modifiers, and this does my understanding something very similar to what Spencer's add-on does. In fact, I think is based on Spencer's code, but gives me an API that felt a lot more at home to me. And so this is what here was a simple example of using an ES6 class. So scroll top modifier, extends modifier, and in this did receive arguments method, you receive a scroll position, and you can set your element's scroll top to the scroll position. And here was an example of using it. And I was like, this looks a lot like what I want to do. All right, kind of in business. I'm going to fast forward through the next like 3 hours of debugging and tell you that let's see, what is it? Babel Transforms version 3 Ember Decorator, add Ember Decorator / Babel Transforms 3 point whatever, the latest, supports Decorator Stage 2, which is no longer a thing, and Octane does not support. Lots of things break, and in ways difficult to figure out. And so finally I went to the Ember Decorators channel on Discord, and Pzorak said, use Babel Transforms 2. I was like, got it, okay? And that made my life a lot better. That's going to be the plan, by the way, is Babel Transform is going to get rolled into Ember CLI Babel and no longer be a thing, so future me will not have to go through this. So I basically thought, like, okay, now that I have this, I think I kind of have enough to start to try to make this thing. So let's go. Oh, let me actually say a few more things about this. Sorry. I just want to talk about the other hooks that we have. So what you get is you get this did receive arguments, which is called whenever the arguments to your modifier change. So in this case, in this example, it would be called every time scroll position changes. And then you have, in addition to that, you have did insert element. Here's an example. And you get will destroy element. I think those are the three that are provided. Does that sound right, Spencer? Any idea? Okay. So, but that 3 is pretty powerful. And, you know, you get to know when did my element appear, when is it going away, and when did the value that I passed to it, to the modifier, change. As we saw earlier, you can only use modifiers right now on elements, and so there's no kind of other fancy, like, I could imagine if I was on a component, I might want to be able to, like, have some API to that component. It's a moot point for now because you can't do it. And the API to the element, well, you do have, it's called the DOM. And so you can do whatever with the element. One note, when you're looking at code like this, maybe there's a default implementation of which method did receive arguments that sets this dot element or something, but I think I don't know. As you'll see in my code, I think it's a little bit different. I think we might have to capture the element there. Anyway, so those are those arguments. So let's go look at some code. So again, the goal was if I hit D, I want to invoke this action. And I wanted to also use Ember Keyboard to do this under the hood. Anybody use Ember Keyboard? Show of hands, a few people. So Ember Keyboard is an Ember add-on for working with the keyboard. The reason that I like Ember Keyboard is that it brings with it a whole bunch of things that are easy to get wrong when you're doing keyboard shortcuts. If you're doing something like a game where there's nothing else on the screen, like in Matt's example, probably no big deal. But normally, in a more of a, I don't know, productivity app, you might have kind of layered things that have their own keyboard handling, and you want something to own the keyboard at this moment. You furthermore want keyboard shortcuts usually to suspend themselves when you are typing in a field, for example. And so Ember Keyboard gives you a lot of that stuff for free. It also has some really nice kind of translation from key codes to a little tiny DSL for describing a key modifier combo. So that's why I decided I was going to use Ember Keyboard. However, that brought me a lot of pain also, which I'll explain in a minute. So here is the basic implementation. I'm going to draw your attention to, for now, just these 3 hooks, these 3 methods that Ember Oil Modifier provides. So I was wrong. This dot element appears to be done for us. So key and action. Action is an optional second argument, I think, that I didn't use. So I should probably remove that. My first pass, I had to pass the action in addition to the modifier, but I wanted to avoid that because I didn't want to have to repeat myself there. So in did receive elements, we set this dot key, and then in did insert element, we register ourselves with a keyboard service. So this is a really nice feature of element modifiers in Ember, because you can connect yourself to some other state and other functionality really easily. So you get your Ember Keyboard's keyboard service injected. Did insert element, we register this modifier object with Ember Keyboard, and in will destroy element, we unregister. Now, this is where the implementation gets kind of hairy, just because of Ember Keyboard's expectations. And as I said in my note here, Ember Keyboard is designed to be used via a mix-in. And when you mix in EM Keyboard? No, EK mix-in. EK mix-in into a component, it brings in Ember evented, and it brings in some other default functionality like a keyboard activated, keyboard priority. However, you can't mix in something into an ES6 class like this. And so I resorted to duck typing this thing to look like what Ember Keyboard expects it to look like. For those of you who haven't run into the phrase duck typing, it means that if you need a duck, then make something like quacks like a duck. And it will work in a loosely typed language like JavaScript. So specifically what Ember Keyboard is calling back on this thing that you register with it is, hey, do you have this particular trigger name? Which in this case, if I hit the D key, we'd say, do you have key down : key D? If so, I return true, otherwise return false. And then later, well, immediately after, then it'll say, okay, trigger that event. And again, if it's this event name that we expect, then click on the element. And that's what triggers the action that is already hooked up to the thing. So, yeah. So anyway, that's, I'm trying to think if there's something else. Oh, so my hope is that Ember Keyboard, we can figure out a different API for doing this more elegantly.
What about just creating a object that Ember object that has that mix-in, and creating one of those?
Yes. Oh, yes. I played around with that, and trying to think what the reason was that I didn't do it. But yeah, I had a little responder object that I was creating. I don't remember. Yeah, I can't remember. But yeah, something like that certainly could work. It would need to have access to this .element, and you would need to keep it up to date, right? When you got your did receive elements, kind of set the key on that responder. But that could definitely work, and let you probably be more elegant than this duck typing thing. So let me show you. What I'm going to do is do a quick demo of this in action, and where we're actually using this, and then show you one other modifier that we made that builds on these ideas and just slightly more sophisticated. So at Yap we use intercom and we have a lot of things that we need to do for customers who write us. In this case, this is me writing from an incognito browser over here. We have a Chrome extension that we wrote that's implemented in Ember. And so Chrome extensions have a keyboard shortcut, so I'm just going to hit Control-Y. And you can see in the top right here, see if I can, it does not grow when I do it. Anyway, this pops up when you hit Control-Y. And now that I have my keyboard helper, I can do things like hit M for this, because I have my keyboard modifier on this button, start masquerading. So if I hit M, then I'm now masquerading as Luke 200, Amelia 200. And if I now hit D, I now open a new tab to that user's dashboard so I can look at what they are experiencing. pretty boring guy, this loop 200 guy. I can control Y again. There's a few other things we can see. If my cursor is in here and I'm searching for someone and then I hit D here, it does not activate that, which is quite nice. We can also do some other helpful things like open that same user in customer I/O by hitting C. So this is super useful on a day-to-day basis. I had this idea of like one other cool feature, which because a lot of times I need to open multiple views on this user to help them sufficiently. So let's say I need their Yap admin screen as well as to look them up in customer I/O. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to be able to hold down Shift to open it in the background, or something in the background. So if I hit Shift C, Shift A, I can now open customer I/O and the Yap admin. And so that required, well, I could have done multiple modifiers. I think that would have worked fine if I added some way to specify Shift. But instead, I did it a little bit differently. And so I just want to show that real quick, and then we'll wrap up. Go large. Okay. So let's find where this stuff is. User links, HBS. So here's the button usage. We saw this already. This is real world, not the README version. And then here is, for example, the admin link. So this one's a little bit different. It's a different modifier. It's launch tab shortcut A. And launch tab shortcut is the thing that knows how to do a Shift or A. And that is really not going to be a surprise given what you've learned already. The only thing different here is that we're injecting the Chrome service in addition to the keyboard service. The Chrome service is a little wrapper that we made that just wraps the Chrome extension API. Same code in these three methods, no different. Same thing in has, except for we also listen for Shift plus the key. And then in the actual trigger, we say if you're holding down Shift, we call launch tab with false, which is put it in the background. Otherwise, we call launch tab with true. And that's it. So that was my adventure, our adventure in element modifiers. They're pretty awesome, I have to say. I am now like delighted every time I use this, which is about 50 times today, at least. If you have a project like this in your arsenal, something which maybe not mission critical, not user facing, you can experiment a little bit in it. One thing I will add is to get this to use Octane the same way that you can do Ember new -B in that Octane blueprint thing, you can use Ember init with -B in that Octane blueprint, and then it'll kind of diff against your current project and let you upgrade. Cool. Any questions? Awesome.
Thank you.
That's a wrap, yeah. Right across, go down the elevator, go out this door to the right. Right across the street is Croton Reservoir.
Croton Reservoir. So thank you for joining us tonight. We'll see you in April. I think we're going to have maybe a fast foodie talk if Jonathan's watching. Yeah, we'll see you over at Croton Reservoir.